Police matters leave in their wake masses of stuff. Files, reports, testimony, photographs, notes, whole collections of physical evidence, things. Forensic materials, once they're no longer pertinent to any current case, are typically consigned to filing cabinets or cupboards in back rooms of police stations and local courthouses or prisons, and they lodge in retired detectives' private collections. Sometimes they turn up in deceased estates. That old forensic material derives originally from very dramatic humors and may sometimes still bear residues of those dramas. But very often the things resurface without context: a photo without annotation, a strange document, an unlabelled drawing or identikit. Old forensic things often seem so ripe, so ready to yield, so demanding of some sort of story-making intervention. But how? How is that to be done? Why? For whom? When which parts exactly need to be narrated? In 2001, I was invited to guest curate an exhibition at Sydney's Justice and Police Museum. They had a title, Crimes of Passion, for which I was to select content. Over the previous few years, I published 3 retro crime novels, and on the basis of that was to be given a free hand in choosing material and selecting themes for that exhibition. That went okay, and it led to other exhibitions and publications which continued to centre on forensic records. So I've ended up spending, a couple of decades more delving into that sort of stuff. Back then, images, documents, items of evidence were displayed on the museum walls and examined in audio-visual production, explicated in accompanying books. My approaches, I found, varied from matter to matter. They had to. Sometimes it was about simple recount of the bare facts of a particular police matter. Other times I found I was analysing actual material objects or images. And other times, in other circumstances, it meant narrating the individual lives of victims, perpetrators, cops, witnesses, next of kin, bystanders even. The routine research processes I was following back then led me on to other collections. At one point, I was given access to a back room in police headquarters, which was full of haphazardly stacked mid-early 20th century homicide files. They'd been set aside for possible subject matter for authors, contributors to the Australian Police Journal, a fantastic sort of trade paper of policing in Australia, which often explores old homicide cases. More recently, I've been exploring the personal papers of my policeman uncle, the late Brian Doyle, who figured in a number of quite important Sydney police cases from the 1930s right through to the 1970s. The documents in this collection, which were handed over to me, were not dissimilar to the ones I knew from those other archives. A mix of carefully prepared documents and statements and labelled pictures, mixed in with utterly cryptic handwritten notes, completely mysterious ephemera, and unannotated photos. And it didn't appear in sort of nice index folders. It was in plastic bags, tough plastic bags, 1990s that had, fertilizer and stuff had been delivered in. So that's the way you tend to find these things. This kind of work isn't about going to an archive or a collection to look something up, to track down a fact or to test a hypothesis. In my case, as with many other researchers in this sort of area, you just go to see what's there. It's a kind of systematic browsing. So I'm still following the same procedure now as when I started. I look at a lot of material, try to decide if there's a story there to tell, one that might be of interest to readers, to museum goers or whatever, and to research communities, and then try to find a way of telling it. I observe, the requirements of orthodox scholarship on the one hand, and those of entertainment and sort of informed diversion on the other. So the question becomes, what's to be done with the stuff? You can put that as an authorial question. or a curatorial question. What's the story here? Who are the characters? What's the hook? Where's the lead? What are the major themes? And so on. Well, that can be framed as a pretty near parallel academic question in the phraseology of the academic world. What gaps in the knowledge are to be addressed? What new knowledge is being created? What's the research question? Commonplace terms. But I think we need to take a step even further back and ask, what actually is the research object? Is it the crime itself, the social, political, gender, economic culture that it arises from? Is it the players? Is it their inner lives? Or is it some more vaguely zeitgeisty emanation or sort of historical residue, a kind of vibe? Or is it the material culture item itself, the physical thing, and its particularities and intricacies? There's no answer. It's kind of all those things, I suppose. But to borrow a maxim from elsewhere and rephrase it, to me, often the least interesting thing about a crime case is the actual crime itself, the shooting, bludgeoning, stabbing, ripping and running. It's everything else that's of interest. Everything but the crime. But having said that, sometimes it is the crime. Sometimes the ripping and running and shooting is really fascinating too. So I'd like to actually look at some cases now. The first few I want to just talk through that I'm continuing, all these things I'm talking about today I'm still working on, but I'm sort of at a kind of late first draft stage, I suppose. So it's very much a work in progress. But the first few I want to talk about are from the collection of Brian Doyle, that random couple of bags of papers and photos and bits of stuff. There was, this floor plan turned up among Brian's stuff. It's quite large, and as you can see, it's very intricately rendered. And in fact, obviously, somebody with fairly good technical drawing skills, who happened to be a cop in the scientific branch at the time. Now, I first encountered this with all the Brian Doyle stuff, and it's masses. It covers a lifelong career in a random way. So this was of interest to me, but I didn't chase it up right off. But I did note the inscription, the caption at the bottom, plan of room 626, 6th floor, Mansion House, private hotel, Elizabeth Street, Sydney. So, and clearly, if you can see there's a rendering of what appears to be a corpse in the hotel bed there. Anyway, I left that aside, put it on hold while I was doing other work. And of course, as so often happens, while I was looking for something else entirely, I came across this headline in a Herald, in Sydney Morning Herald of the 1940s, dead woman in hotel room. And, it's really awful, but I'll read the first paragraph. Grim discovery in Sydney. The body of a young woman lying on a bed and the body of a newly born child wrapped in newspapers in a suitcase were found yesterday in a room at the Mansion House Private Hotel, Elizabeth Street, City. The girl, aged 2.5, was sitting on a chair in the room, which was being flooded by a running tap over a wash basin, and on it goes. So I kind of kept that and put it aside and went, I'll get back to that. And it's a newspaper, their names there. So I got the record from the old coroner's papers from state records, and it's a really it's every bit as ghastly as that headline would suggest. But then, you read a coronial inquest, they're very detailed and everything has gone into. So basically, the story seemed to be this. It's 1944. Two sisters from the bush are living together at Paddington. They're working in defence industries. They're young women. The younger sister comes later, stays with the older sister. War was party town, apart from everything else. The youngest sister fell pregnant to an American sailor named Jack, who'd sailed out, and now she was sort of 8 months pregnant. But she was going to have she was 8 months pregnant. The older sister arranged a weekend away for the two sisters. their divorcee friend, the divorcee's 2.5-year-old little girl, and two soldiers, two friends of theirs. They were coming up to Katoomba. But somehow, according to the story given at the coroner's inquest, at the last moment, the pregnant sister, it was decided that she should stay at the Mansion House Private Hotel, which was quite near Central Station, and that the little girl would stay with her to keep her company. And it was sort of put in the inquest that that would be a kind of treat. And the way the older sister told it, her younger sister said, "No, don't worry about me. You know, I'll be fine. You know, we'll have fun here, and we'll go to the cafe for dinner." And so the older sister, the divorcee friend, and the two guys, now a happy foursome, head off on the train to the mountains. But meanwhile, the woman goes into labour, and the rest follows on from that. So who's to know what happened there? There is a name Doyle associated with that. One of the cops, the first cop there was a Sergeant Doyle. But of course, it ends up being that's not the case. That's not this case here at all. This is another one. So, and it was only when I got the kind of coroner's documents that I realised it wasn't room 626. Now, this one is an even more horrible story, perhaps, which I will give you the sort of outline of. It's 10 years later, and again, a soldier is involved, a soldier on leave, an Australian soldier who's been in Korea, starts drinking at the Civic Hotel, which some of you may know, rock and roll hotel in the 70s and 80s across the road in Goulburn Street. Yeah, he and a lady start drinking. They drink all afternoon. They're really wrecked by 3 o'clock, and they check into the Mansion House Hotel with another bottle of whiskey. There's noise heard during the night. The next day, a porter forces the door, and the woman's there is dead, and she's suffered a very violent death. The soldier's nowhere to be seen. He oddly gets on a train and comes up to the Blue Mountains as well for some reason. He's found soon enough. And it's just ghastly, really, because he pleads not guilty to murder. He said he was too drunk to remember that all that had happened. He'd woken up in the morning and there was this, beaten dead person in the bed next to him. Anyway, so they were all male juries then, and something that anybody who researches this stuff soon finds out is that all male juries were only too willing to give the benefit of the doubt to a male defendant in a case like this. So I think he was convicted on a much lesser charge. So just back to the kind of meta storytelling thing here. There's a big story, and I guess, to me, the angle, if you like, is it's the gender and juries thing. But then the diagram itself, and when I say the gender and juries thing, I don't mean to be dismissive, but it's a contemporary concern, of course, so much to do with gender violence, of course, that so much of the discourse now is about how grotesquely weighted the history there is, the wrong way, and which people seek to redress now. But also the artifact here is really amazing. You can't help but note the precision, the weird precision of the rendering here. Right, vomit in sink, the false teeth on the vanity basin there, the craven A's, and there's a weird sort of exactitude to everything, but the rendering of the victim is the inept part of the drawing. And so on. And then the other thing that I'm considering with all this too, and that sort of exercises me is the place, the Mansion House Hotel. Now, if you're in Sydney in the 70s, 60s or 80s, maybe you remember the Mansion House Hotel. It was a sort of skid row joint on the corner, you know, taking up a whole block, I think, nearly a whole block on Elizabeth and Goulburn, as I say, right opposite the Civic Hotel. And it was a big place. Now, in the 70s, it was a Darrow, you know, it was a Darrow residential, but it started out as quite a grand hotel. And that's just sort of a seller of about 1 million vintage postcards in Germany happened to have this one. So that was on eBay. That's the best I can get. But it opened with some fanfare. It was a sort of an affordable hotel arriving, you know, for people arriving at Central Station. Look for the neon sign, the ad said. And it advertised in the Herald nearly weekly from when it opened in the 1920s to when it was refurbished in the 80s. And over the years, as I searched, you see the tariff going down, so that by 1974, you could get bed and breakfast for $5 for a night. So that's sort of definitely getting into maybe apprentice from the bush, skid row denizen, and, you know, kind of like a hotel for a quick assignation. Now, the photo that I found years ago in the police record was this one. This was taken in after a road accident, so that's why it focuses on the bit of tram track out the front. But you can see there on the left, one corner of the Mansion House. It's looking pretty scungy by then. So in a way, there's in that sort of psychogeographic way. That's a place, if ever there was a murder scene, you know, from central casting, it was that one, the Dark Hotel. And in fact, as I looked, there's a number of murders turn up over the years in that, you know, a sort of gay assignation in the 1980s and so on. So is it, you know, that's that one. So a rather grim story there, and we'll just move on to the next one. So this is another awful one. I try to get the awful stories out of the way early on, and then we go from really awful to just kind of awful, and that's meant to be a leavening of the mood in my careful management of staging of this talk. Yeah, so this one, this is also from Brian Doyle's material. Actually, on that last one, I don't know why my uncle had that, but he gave lectures to recruits late in his career, in his retirement actually, and he was a good public speaker, and a lot of these things he kept were his props for his talks. Anyway, this was a case he was involved in, and it was quite well known at the time. I'll just read one paragraph that summarises it. Just after 3:30 one rainy Thursday afternoon in July 1967, a 13-year-old schoolgirl arriving home finds the front door open. On the floor in the front bedroom, her younger brother, Stephen, lay dead. He would have arrived home from school just a few minutes before her. The panicked sister thought at first the boy was ill, ran to the neighbours, who called an ambulance and the police. The boy, it turned out, had been hit on the head 12 times, then his throat had been cut from ear to ear. He appeared to have died from loss of blood, which was later confirmed in an autopsy, and his skull had been fractured. He was 11 years old. That was a modest fibro house in Stacey Street, Bankstown. It's not there anymore. And it was owned by the children's grandmother. The kids and their mother had been staying there for the past 2 months after the mother, Edna, had left her husband for the second time. She had been a widow with 7 children when she married him, and he was older, in his 60s, the senior overseer at a municipal council, an engineer. The marriage hadn't worked out. She had left him the previous year. She had sued him for maintenance, but lost the case and had moved back into his Coleroy home at the end of December, then left again for good the following May. So she was down at Bankstown. He was at Coleroy. He was convicted eventually of the murder of that one. He was convicted of murder in that case. And sorry, I just need to read from my notes again here. Yeah, but he pleaded not guilty. The case was purely circumstantial, and in this matter, everything hinged on bits of physical evidence, Excuse me a second, sorry, while I fumble even more with papers. Yeah. So it was a circumstantial case where, you know, and he was a plausible witness. He was, as I say, a man in his 60s, an engineer. Now it's a no-brainer. He's that sort of controlling male psychopath that we read about, you know, a circumstance that has been quite well identified. But at the time, it wasn't so much. So the case that was presented in court eventually, you know, the key bits of evidence were a Masonic ceremonial glove, a white glove with embroidery on it. So I'm coming back to that. A bunch of credit cards, vintage credit cards, I might say, because the key bit of evidence surrounded, it concerned his ownership of a TV and a hire purchase plan and a maintenance plan with H.G. Palmer's, the department store at the time, which he disavowed, and they had to, you know, anyway, that was his, it ended up being a key thing. So there was an umbrella that he'd left at the house on the day. The police believed he went out there to kill the wife and to kill the separated wife, but she didn't turn up, the boy did, and he killed her. It's also, Brian Doyle told a reporter after he retired, when there was a series of stories about his career, that the guy had sort of looked him in the eye at one point and said, "You've got no case, have you?" And more or less taunted him, you know, which classic, you know, the psychopath smirk, I think they call it now, like couldn't help but gloat that he sort of had the upper hand in the case. So it became a very, with the Bankstown detectives, it became a big thing to really nail this person. It was a few years after the Graham Thorne murder as well. So, and they did secure the conviction. But in this, it's, again, it's kind of like there's an almost curatorial attitude to the evidence, the way it's kept and the way Brian kept it for the rest of his career too. There's tons and tons of stuff in the collection. And this is where the guy broke in the back door. I've got this envelope here in the room right now, and there are little wood chips in it, which I won't actually drag out. The other thing that's of interest to me, and just let me go back a bit through these, is Brian kept the files here, and in them there are the transcripts of the various interviews. And it's interesting to see the he said there is the defendant, a guy named Curtis. And when the cops later on write up the exchange, it's interesting, they do edit it just the way journalists do for style, you know. So Curtis said when they were arresting him, can I go to the toilet? Well, Brian or somebody later on thought, can I use the toilet? They edited it for style before it gets submitted in court. And this, which is some stuff about their actual, you know, the sexual relationship between Curtis and his wife, Edna. You know, it's pretty mild stuff, but there was stuff that she objected to, which at the time, it's 1967. Anyway, it's too complex to go into now, but what Brian has written here, this is in the brief to be given to the police prosecutor for the coming murder trial. Brian's written, arguments, sex relationship, it goes on, I can't quite get all that. Prejudicial, extremely peripheral, ought not to be admitted. Something prejudicial effect outweighs the probative effect. So it's kind of interesting reading actual police files to me, is how much, you know, how much it's a worked upon, you know, a police case is a worked upon thing. It's edited. It's so much like if you're in the research community, it's so much like a research article, or so much like a, you know, like an exhibition, like curating an exhibition, or like writing a piece of nonfiction. There's like every little angle and the sort of subtext to everything. When the cops take it really seriously, which isn't always, but when they do take it seriously, everything, they're sort of, they're orchestrating mood and the performative thing of the actual, the stage of the court, of the theatre of the court, how mindful, and certainly in this case, the the cops are. Look here, on this point, this was a point that Brian thought the guy was really vulnerable on. Really cross-examine on this, hammer the guy on this. Yeah, and again, can I turn off the refrigerator? Well, no, better, can I turn the refrigerator off? Brian thought it might be a bit better, and so on. Okay, so that's that one. It's a pretty awful matter. Just let me see how we're going for time here. Okay. Now I'm just thinking whether we should. Okay, I've written about this one. There's an article I wrote in the Sydney Review books, and there will be a chapter in the book about the Kingsgrove slasher case. So I'm not even going to explain the case to those who don't know it. It was huge in the 50s, but it involved this guy assaulting in the dead of night, a prowler, many people, you know, maybe 50, and it involved slashing with increasing violence, sleeping women and girls. He was a kind of the classic cat burglar type. He could get in anywhere. So that was a really famous case. Brian led the thing that brought him in. Yeah, and it terminated in 58. A thing that came up out of this was of interest to me, and it ended up more or less hijacking the whole story, was that the attacks all took place around Kingsgrove, Bexley, Bardwell Park, Arncliffe. Now, if you know that part of Sydney, it's sort of, in the 50s, that's a kind of new middle class, lower middle class Sydney. It's where Brian Doyle himself lived. The slasher, when he was found, turned out to live in quite a respectable house with a young wife. He had a perfectly respectable job as a sort of clerk in a warehouse. And this guy, Henry Gifford Eardley, lived in the area as well. And he was a bird watcher. He founded the St. George Historical Society. He was a railways engineer. He published a number of pamphlets about New South Wales railways history. He wrote a pamphlet about the historic house in the area, Lytham Hall, which is where Christina Stead grew up. He knew Christina Stead's brother, and in fact, there's letters between the brother and Christina saying, "Oh, you know, this guy has written a history of Lytham Hall." And in fact, this chap is a little bit, it turns out, sort of a polymath, an interesting guy, kind of a little bit like the father in The Man Who Loved Children, maybe. But he and Brian Doyle, the slasher, these cases went on for years. And the interesting thing about it, it's so full of detail that I could spend hours talking about it. But Eardley, who was the nature lover, you know, this is 57, 58, 59, when nature loving wasn't such a thing. And that part of Sydney, Walleye Creek, was just regarded as sort of wasteland. But Eardley was terribly interested in it as well. And he was quite a good watercolorist. He did paintings which are in the State Library of, you know, historic, you know, buildings around the district. But he did this map for Brian Doyle of the Walleye Creek bush, you know, now much valued, much loved by Sydneysiders. And he worked out how the slasher was getting past all the police cordons and was slipping into houses. And they used this map, beautifully drawn map. Brian Doyle and Eardley went on for so long, they both became obsessed with the case, and they formed this sort of, you know, they buddied up. They spent all day, every day, right through the summer of 58, 59, walking through the creek, working out, and the bush there and the escarpments, working out every single way the slasher could be getting around. So that's kind of interesting. It didn't turn up in the papers at the time. That just happens to be, Brian wrote that up in his report to his seniors in the police force after the case. So that's interesting. And then I sort of rang the Eardleys, you know, they're in the phone book, and because I was really interested in, turns out Eardley's daughter, Elaine Elizabeth Eardley, was probably the only person through the whole 50, 60, 70, 80 attacks who genuinely took a swing at the Kingsgrove slasher and hit him. A few people claimed to have sort of wrestled him and things, but she definitely did. And I spoke to her. She's a retired sort of academic and a priest now. And she remembered it quite clearly. Like, so 17-year-old saw the hand come in the window near where her visiting cousin was sleeping, tiptoed around the room just before dawn, picked up a slipper one of her own shoes, which was on the floor, tiptoed around, whipped the blind out and whacked the guy. Now that's like sort of fronting the context of the time. Jack the Ripper, you know, he was a scary person. He inflicted very painful injuries. He didn't murder anybody, but that wasn't far off. Anyway, that was an interesting little sideline too. And when I rang the Eardleys, you know, I thought they're really the story there. Like, in fact, when I spoke to Elaine's brother, the first contact I made, I said, "Oh, you know, your father played a really important part in tracking down the slash." He says, "Oh yeah, I remember that." Yeah, but he was like the guy who planned the trap. I went, yeah, that'd be right. And like everyone I spoke to in the family was just like, "Oh yeah, that'd be like." It wasn't a big deal, including Elaine Eardley. Like I said, you know, it's kind of gutsy thing to do in scary circumstances. She said, "Oh well, it needed to be done." Yeah. So there was a sort of like suburban heroes there. So that's that story. Now, one more perhaps from Brian's case. This one, which is, you know, most police photos are really, check out the time. You know what? I'm going to miss that one. You have to read that one in the book if you ever see it, because it's taken me much longer than I thought. Now, I just want to read one more little piece here. Okay. A few years ago, I'm leaving the Brian Doyle archive at the moment, and now I'm just talking about general police cases of the 50s and 60s that I've been researching for a long time. And the research I've done had been triggered by work on a collection of forensic photos held in Sydney by State Records of New South Wales Archives. A few years ago, I came up against issues of access and publication rights regarding the forensic photographs I'd been researching. So I'd put aside a whole lot of photos. I was planning to write about those photos. So suddenly I didn't have the photos, but I had the stories. So I started making sketches, charcoal, pencil and ink, loosely improvising on the sources. I had by this time spent years with the data and thought I knew the cases pretty well. But making drawings was a surprising experience. The process felt strangely comfortable and, without overstating it, produced a new and different awareness of the matters. There was another case which I wanted to put in for balance of a wife who was the subject of drunken abuse from a husband, who picked up the bread knife. In fact, now that I'm telling you, picked up the bread knife after King hit her, after she tried to wake him up to tell him it was time to go to work, after he'd gotten it at 4:30 drunk the night before. He hit her and she went and picked up the knife. And as she said in court later on, I held the knife fearing that he might hit me again. He lunged at me and impaled himself on the knife. To which, you know, reading it in 2020, you go, good on you, well done. And the court seems to have thought the same. Not only was she acquitted on the murder charge, the court acquitted her on the manslaughter charge. She didn't do any jail at all. So she did have a baby girl and a 3-year-old child. So the courts didn't always get it horrendously gender wrong. Anyway, this will be the last one I talk about. This is my rendering of a couple of photographs, which I can't use the photographs, but 1962, the negatives were labelled Indian hemp in possession. Now, to me, this is terribly interesting because 62 is quite early for pot culture in Sydney. It's a 70s thing in Australia. But of course, what's more of interest in here is the piano, the drum kit, you know, the coffee and the stuff on the walls, you know, the matchstick blinds and the disposal store parachute and the wall hangings, which I know as a sort of share house person, so that's what one did, egg cartons on the walls to baffle the sound while bands practiced. And this is 1962. And, you know, this might be the first modern share house in Australia. And there was a name on it. The person is still around. I knew people who knew him. I spoke to the guy who'd been busted for the pot back in 1962 in a share house. He was a jazz player. down in Woolloomooloo in Sydney. Now, I thought in some of the photos here, which again I can't show you, the cops stood on that table and to get photos of the egg cartons tacked to the wall. Now, you know, sharehouse people of the 70s and 80s will know before we had acoustic material, people tacked egg cartons on the wall. But the cops are obviously so kind of baffled by it. Crikey, you know, they've taken leave of their senses. They're nailing the egg cartons to the wall. So the cops have gotten up and taken photographs of the egg cartons. So I already knew it was a funny story. It was a sort of hipsters versus the fuzz story. But then when I rang up the guy, the piano player, he's in his 80s and a fantastic raconteur and intelligent and wonderful guy, and it was one of really enlightening conversation, very sophisticated guy. So, you know, I said, yeah, so, you know, Seth Abbott, the drug squad back at your place in 1962. He said, yeah, but the story wasn't jokey, you know. So they came through the front door with a sledgehammer and an axe, and they took him down to Central and they roughed him up and they threw him in a cell at Long Bay and remand with two guys who were planning on killing a guard and escaping. And he was scared shitless. And he got a 556A, got sent out to Broughton Hall, which was a psych facility. And after a week there, a psychiatrist, just a couple of years older than he was at the time, he said a very beautiful and sensitive woman, is how he described her, said to him, "You think this is a joke, don't you? But you really need to be here." And he stayed there for 6 months, and he was in a bad psychological way. So that was a kind of interesting story to me. And the reason I mention that is there's just so much sort of social, cultural history in that tableau, but it doesn't play out the way you might think. And, you know, I mean, like most people, I think, you know, even back in the 70s, we thought he had a lot of pot, by the way. You know, he was practicing 12 hours a day. He was smoking. He had 2 ounces of grass, which, you know, back in the 70s, grass was sold in matchboxes, and to have 2 ounces is a lot. So, yeah, he was in an condition. So, so that's of interest too. It's also of interest that the way he spoke about Broughton Hall, and suddenly the language of psychiatry and psychiatric intervention is just becoming commonplace at that time. Psychopharmaceuticals, therapies, diagnoses, that all became, you know, it's when 19th nervous breakdown, psychotic reaction, manic depression, they were pop songs a few years after this. But this is a little bit before. This is before Keith Richards had his first joint. So look, maybe I'll leave it there. That's probably enough. I could bang on about that. It's a rich story to me. But if you paid attention to all this and haven't gone out and made yourselves cups of tea, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Great talk. We do have some questions from some of the audience, and you're happy to go through those?
I am.
I'll read them out to you. It's all good. So we have one from Robin, and Robin asks, wondering how often some of our former police and other writers of police events rely on Peter's research to assist their stories and books.
I wouldn't know. I know that the photos that are, you know, that I had the privilege of researching back when they hadn't been much looked at, that are held, you know, as Crown Archives, that is the people's property. A lot of those turned up. You know, I was really thrilled to see in the new season of Fargo that it's set in the mid 20th century, and they've used exactly the Sydney sort of mugshot format as little stills, as very cool stills in the program to sort of introduce characters. And the Sydney mugshots, the way they were done, you know, full body shot on one side and a close-up on the other side, and they split the two, and they had to write on the negative on the emulsion backwards, so the writing's all wonky. It's exactly what you see in Fargo. And then there was a reference to a book that an author, Luke Sand, wrote called Evidence, which is a whole lot of New York crime scenes from the early 20th century. They set up a whole lot of their scenes in Fargo also in reference to Luke Sand's Evidence, and I actually mentioned it to him in an email. I said, you know, you see, there's a whole lot of evidence and there's a whole lot of Sydney mugshots. And he goes, yes. And some other references to a folk photographer, a guy named Dis Farmer, all in the first 2 episodes of Fargo. And Luke said, the mysterious figure who sat in on his lecture at Bard University last year and sort of furiously took notes. His lecture on vernacular photography. So, yeah, so visually one certainly has effect. I don't know about the actual cases so much.
Is it, so that's the most recent season of Fargo, is it?
Yeah, the
Yeah,
brand,
okay.
yeah, it's just out, yeah, with Chris Rock. It's pretty good. I've only watched 2 episodes, but there's a bit of Sydney in there.
Great, I'll have to check that one out. I think it's on SBS. So we have a question from Trisha. Do you know if files still exist in police stations now or have been moved to the state archives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, no, maybe, kind of. They're all over the place. You know, state records, state archives are fantastic, and they really kind of look after stuff. And there is an Archive Act, and this is not my remit at all, but they rely on departments sending stuff to them, and the police stuff is everywhere. Like I said, you know, the room down in Goulburn Street where there's just murder files stacked high, they're all great. And they go, yeah, mate, have a look. Yeah, they're really good. And other stuff will be in homicide and drug squad and, you know, all the negatives that make up the forensic photography archive. I think for a while they were just sitting in a cell at Darlinghurst Police Station. So stuff is working its way back to the central archives. But very slowly. And meanwhile, the police keep their record. They have their own record keeping, or they used to a few years ago, their own record keeping branch. And they were really great people too, their own internal archivists, because police stuff can go on for a long time. So files can take a long time before they're dead. And 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer, 12 years ago, there was stuff in the police archives. That was a beautifully maintained archive that went back to the 1920s. So that they hadn't handed over to state records to the bunker out at Kingswood yet. So I'm not sure what the situation is now, but they can be very, very hard to find. And the police don't really encourage researchers. And, you know, I mean, I understand that, nor can they, because, things are under the bone these days.
We have a question from Jacob, and it's about your motives for studying this type of material. So I'll just read it out to you. So Jacob would like to know. What do you find motivates you for dwelling in the darker parts of human experience? Because you've said that crime itself is often the least interesting part of these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of tried, you know, fell into it in a way. I mean, I wrote about music history as well, and, you know, other things. But crime is, you know, crime brings everything into it. You know, like a snapshot of an entire world in every little crime, pretty much. And it's like when something that was hitherto beneath the surface and maybe unexpressed, maybe not even thought coherently, you know, privately by people, but experienced in some way, suddenly that becomes manifest. Somebody lashes out, there's an act of violence, there's a transgression, something's taken or broken, and then suddenly there's this massive, like empirical project to get to the bottom of it. Now that's when it happens right, you know, and there's not a fit up or somebody's framed, but when it happens correctly, and sometimes it does, there's this extraordinary investigation of this little tiny moment in human life, in societal life. And it involves society, it involves, you know, a single soul, if you like, a single consciousness and a single unconscious, but it involves everything else, the currents, the things of society. So you just don't get anything richer. I mean, I sometimes thought, you know, well, you could go to a site if somehow, you know, century-old psychiatrist files were accessed. That might be pretty interesting. Or even a neighbourhood doctor. Yeah, that'd be interesting too, just the cases that a doctor visits. You know, there'd be story there. Or, you know, the water board inspector. Yeah, there'd be story there. The health and safety inspectors who went round to the pubs. But the thing about crime is that it's already story. It's kind of like I was talking about with the Brian Doyle stuff. People have already made it into a story. and that story might be contested, it might be flagrantly wrong, or it might actually contain quite a lot of insight. But it's the work's half done. Yeah, I don't know. There's no simple answer. It's a good question, Jacob. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. But I must say, I try to navigate away from the sort of, like I hate that true crime where they go, the stabbing, the shooting, they're killing, the gore. It's a bit like sort of bad sex. It's often sexier to keep the sex off the page. Well, I think it's kind of often the case with crime too.
Well, there's plenty of questions to get through, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I can collect these questions for you, Peter, and submit them to you if you like.
Yeah, great. Look, I could just, if anybody wants to contact me, I did have a few questions to actually ask, just to canvas, but my email address was on that first PowerPoint screen. I might just go back to it. Feel free to contact me at Macquarie. Hang on, I'll just put it up. But I can be found on the Macquarie University online directory, the staff directory. But here we go. But there I am there. So it's just my name, with the Macquarie Uni thing. So yeah, I like hearing from people who have things to offer or questions.
Great, excellent. Well, that's an invitation for everyone who had great questions, but we've just run out of time. We just can't go through them all. Thank you, Peter, for such a great talk. It was very interesting, delving into some of the darker bits of our history. And you mentioned you got a new book coming out, possibly.
Yeah, well, I was going to call it Suburban Noir, and then everything was noir, and I went, I can't call it that. It's become a shocking cliche. But now it's past, and nothing's called noir anymore. So it probably will be called Suburban Noir, and maybe sometime next year. I hope it'll.
Fantastic, and everyone can keep an eye out for that.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been fabulous. Thank you.
No, thanks. Thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.